yeah, it's kind of a starter of a workshop or a kind of work in progress that we're hoping to expand on a bit. And we received the small grant scheme to look at different ways to critically analyse space with a kind of gender lens, and we've expanded on that throughout the presentation. So firstly, just like a quick content warning, a lot of discussions around kind of inclusivity, safety, etc. can be slightly triggering for some people, so we always like to just keep this in. We won't be offended if anyone kind of dips out at any point. And then an intro to us, Kirsty and Millie, or Amelia professionally. We both studied in Dundee. I did architecture and Millie did urban planning. And kind of after leaving, we combined our different interests. Mine was primarily on kind of inclusive design and community engagement in design, and Millie's was more about gender and placemaking and like feminist policy and design. So we've kind of combined those two things and initiated HerCollective last year with a series of different projects, which we'll kind of touch on at the end. But this was kind of a main driver.
So yeah, just to get started, why this topic is important. Cities were historically planned and designed for and by men, and so typically reflected traditional gender roles where men were the breadwinners and women were the homemakers. And despite there being huge advances in gender equality, the layout of cities has stayed the same, and so women's needs haven't necessarily always been considered when plans are made or designed. And the rapid urbanisation in the last 50 years has resulted in a lot of outer city development, which has established suburbs or longer distances for people to commute to core areas or the centre for work, education or leisure. This rush development has unintentionally resulted in non-inclusive cities and places that have been restricted to the needs of the male population. Women's safety is a key attribute of an inclusive city. The concept of women's safety has been at the forefront of mainstream media since the death of Sarah Everard in 2021, where she was tragically murdered on her way home from a friend's. And this tragedy instigated the United Nations figure that 97% of women and girls had experienced some sort of sexual harassment or assault. And although planning, design and architecture isn't the sole reason to blame for women feeling unsafe or the horrendous incidents that happen when women are walking home, better street lighting or minimising the alleyways and widening pavements, etc., are all things that planning should be considering and then implementing through the design and development process. So why is planning for women important? Planning aims to improve the quality of life whilst allowing citizens to experience higher levels of prosperity and achieve sustainability. If we're making more inclusive spaces, we're going to increase economic growth. So putting inclusivity at the forefront of planning and design would result in enhancing overall gender equality. And gender equality is a key driver for economic growth. And with the UK making, or with women making up more than half of the UK population, from including women in community engagement to understanding what is needed in our areas to promote a sense of safety and security and provide equal opportunities, would allow women to navigate spaces in a way that the male population has done for centuries. Planning for women is also important because it would enhance sustainability, and the United Nations, the World Bank and the European Union have all said that sustainability can't be achieved without gender equality, and it's actually included in some of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 3 and number 11. And also planning for women would result in just a general improvement in quality of life and own physical well-being and mental well-being for women, as well as creating a sense of belonging in our areas. And lastly, it would result in more, well, just better overall development of our cities and towns.
So a couple of these slides are slightly a crash course, so forgive us if they're a little bit of an overview. But quite a lot of feminist and kind of women-centered theory also then relates to queer theory. And quite a lot of our work is focused on femme people, women and queer people. So a lot of these experiences in regards to safety in public space and perception of safety and welcoming within the built environment are interrelated between these groups. So just like a slightly quick intro to queer theory, queer spaces generally is focused on breaking boundaries between the spaces for and not for certain groups and marginalized groups in particular. Like Judith Butler writes quite a lot about how feminist spaces are less performative. There's also kind of a theory that a lot of the people in marginalized groups, in particular women and queer people, have a kind of similar trauma and are more interested in a caring society and spaces that feel safe and free of shame, and just generally more kind of inclusive and accessible. So that's been quite a large driver in terms of our work and in terms of making spaces more inclusive in general. We also just wanted to quickly touch on policy in terms of kind of feminist urbanism and women in design. So a lot of our work so far is based in Scotland. So we've kind of used the Scottish planning policy an example here, just kind of in relation to inclusivity. So as Millie's kind of mentioned, the UN prioritise equality and in particular gender equality, as well as things like affordability and inclusivity, accessibility, etc. And this can then trickle down to UK and Scottish policy, both in design and also kind of more generally. So things like the Planning Scotland Act through to things like the Equality Act 2010. And then kind of more specifically, this feeds into general dialogues around sustainability, access to amenities, things like the 20-minute neighbourhood, and how that's kind of being implemented within Scotland.
So to determine how inclusive a public space actually is, there's a few questions that we can ask ourselves and in a way to critically analyse how safe or welcoming an area is. So first of all, how reliable or accessible public transport is. So if buses are running on time, trains aren't being cancelled, there's enough space for someone to get a pram on or a wheelchair on. And then that goes on to natural surveillance at public transport stops or stations, well-lit areas, and more natural surveillance. So the concept of eyes on the street. And accessibility actually on the streets. So wide pavements that are wide enough for somebody to push a buggy on or to have a group of people walk along without having to go and step into the road, for example. And then general pedestrianisation in city centres. Women are more likely to walk, so having these areas is a concept of a gender inclusive space. And then how well maintained these areas are. So if there's potholes or overgrown vegetation or graffiti that could be intimidating. And then when we're designing these spaces, asking ourselves whether we would feel safe or your kids would feel safe or your parents or your grandparents, and thinking about how different people use or access a different area and what they might need from a city themselves.
So quite a lot of, or a large proportion of what we have been doing within this project is using film photography as a way of kind of picking random points almost kind of instantaneously and sporadically as we're kind of traveling about, and using them to understand who is and isn't using public space, why would they be using this space or not? Is the space welcoming? And then kind of what indicators there are as we've kind of gone through here. So this is an example of us kind of going through a random photograph that's taken on a little road up from the Water of Leith, if anyone is local to Edinburgh or knows Edinburgh, and kind of started to highlight different points on that photograph that would potentially make people feel unsafe or would allow people to avoid using the space, such as no CCTV, no visible street lighting, a lack of natural surveillance, and kind of the visual clutter and overgrown vegetation and things that can tend to happen when spaces become a little bit more neglected. So we're going to do a slight interactive portion, and we've got a series of photographs that have been taken, and we just kind of wanted everyone to put either a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a yes or no if you would feel particularly safe or welcome within these spaces. If anyone particularly wants to like elaborate on it or consider anything further, so I don't know if you have children or anything like that you think is relevant, then also please put that in the chat box. We'll maybe give everyone like a couple of minutes to think. But quite a lot of the things that we kind of picked out where like people are actively using some of the park space. There's wide pavements. It's generally not very cluttered. There's good eye line vision, etc. But welcome any further thoughts in the chat. So we've had quite a few comments about night. And yep, completely agree. Lack of lighting, large open space, the kind of barrier or the shrubbery on the right hand side feels slightly intimidating as well. It's almost like you're kind of closed in, and there's a kind of portion that you can't see very well, or it's kind of just at eye level. And yeah, the eyes on the street as well. We're kind of going to touch on that a little bit.
It's interesting, when we conducted this presentation at a university workshop, we kind of had most of the girls say that they wouldn't feel safe, and then we had boys saying that they would feel safe, but depending on the time of day. So it's interesting to see that it's kind of a different response now.
Yeah, and a comment about if there was no one there, then you might feel safe. I think that's quite an important thing, right? That you, it can be quite intimidating if you're kind of walking through a public space and you can kind of hear things but aren't necessarily able to see what's going on, and the lack of street lighting, and probably just the lack of kind of housing just around the perimeter. Nice, right. I think we might move on to the next one. Okay.
Yeah, so same again, whether you would or wouldn't feel safe and why.
I think for this one of the things that we kind of highlighted when we conducted our prior workshop as a kind of precursor to this is that sometimes it's also who else is using the space that can affect how you feel about it. So if there's, I don't know, kind of like a large group of people that look slightly intimidating, then you would feel less safe. Whereas, for example, in this one, it's kind of like two, if I remember correctly, like older ladies with their dogs, so you maybe feel slightly more safe. And that's quite an interesting part to play, although I suppose something that we can't overly control. We almost just need to push for people to feel like they can use the space, and that would gradually lead to feeling more safe. Yeah, comments.
Yeah. No escape route. I think as well, with it not being a straight path, you can't see what's coming. And it's always dark underneath the underpass, regardless how much, at night anyway, regardless of how much lighting there actually is.
Mm-hmm. Something that's quite interesting about this example as well, there isn't very good street lighting, and as people have said, there's not kind of overlooking housing or anything really, but it is very uncluttered, and I think that can sometimes help. You almost feel like it's a little bit more of a through route rather than you feeling slightly trapped in it. And yeah, a lot of comments about the time of day. Yeah, Andrew's point is quite interesting about depend on other people living in the area, etc. I think that's very true, and this exercise that we've kind of done would be something that we would encourage people to do almost if they're on like a site visit, or to include within their initial feasibility studies of kind of the areas around sites, which would allow you to kind of feed all that information in as well. But what we're kind of trying to do with these photographs is it's almost a snapshot, and it allows you to critically analyze it and test different things and identify what the kind of key things are that almost make you feel unsafe or unwelcome in space, and then how that might reflect on other people as well. But a really interesting point. Okay, will we go next one?
Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's hard when you don't know the area yourself, or just from looking at a photo. But say if this was a residential area, you might feel safe. Whereas if it was more used as an office and it's only busy 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, and you're walking down here on a Saturday evening, it might feel less safe. But with it being residential, there's people usually around, or there'll be people in the houses that you can, you know, you're kind of being overlooked.
Yeah, this one's slightly different to a lot of the other ones. There is quite a lot of overlooking, or a fair amount of overlooking housing, kind of public access, which may make you feel more safe. Something that we kind of picked up on, or why we picked it out, is there's quite a lot of kind of clutter that can kind of lead to you feeling slightly wary, and also you can see that the kind of wall is partially gone, and so you don't really know what's on the other side. It feels slightly like a broken boundary, which is kind of identified generally as making people feel slightly less safe, because as I think someone said earlier, you never know like who's on the other side of that, or if they can kind of have access to you or anything.
and the cobblestones as well. If you're pushing a wheelchair or a pram, it's not easy to walk along, and you can't just picture whether there's a dropped curb going on to cross the road, but there's no pavement on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting seeing everyone's comments about kind of traffic and how that might impact. That's something that's quite interesting in terms of things moving away from people generally using cars and more towards bikes and walking, and how that can kind of impact. I know quite a lot of people generally would take their car if they thought they were going somewhere that they wouldn't necessarily feel safe walking through. So how that can kind of input onto how you're moving around a city, and how those experiences almost shape how you use spaces. Okay, keep going.
So Vienna in Austria, the capital of Austria, is considered by the World Bank and many other leading organisations as a successful example of what good planning and design with a gender lens can look like. So it's considered one of the most gender inclusive cities in the world. There's equal spaces for both the residents and the people that live there, and visitors. The city of Vienna works on making people feel seen and welcome through integrating accessibility and inclusive principles or initiative throughout the public space. And gender mainstream examples can be found throughout the city for that benefit marginalized groups. So for example, on the left, the lift that goes from one street level to the other, and is also clear glass, so you can see what's there on the outside, you can see what's happening inside, good lighting so you can see what's happening any time of day. The key example in Vienna in 1997, a study looked into how parks were used by boys and girls, and they found that after a certain age, girls stopped going to parks because there's a lot of spaces in parks for basketball or for football, and girls often feel intimidated going to these spaces. So Vienna adapted lots of strategies for the younger population so that there's a space for people to sit and talk, or there's more than one space to play basketball, or not just basketball and football spaces for people to play in, for children to play in. They've also tried to reduce the overall height in residential areas, because often skyscrapers or cityscapes can be quite intimidating, and outside the working hours result in places being quite quiet and people not being around. Vienna, also, the city council organised group night walks for spaces to be identified that needed more lighting or wider pavements. And they found that parks are often, the same way over here, are a shortcut during the day, but people will avoid them at night because you don't know what's going on in the park, it's dark, there's not enough lighting. So they adapted citywide strategies within the parks to make them more accessible and welcoming for people to use at any time of day. And Vienna is a prime example of how even a historically laid out city, like many of the cities across the UK, can be adapted to suit the needs of a whole population. Often in the UK, there's a lot of conservation laws and regulations on listed buildings as what can and can't be adapted or changed. So things end up staying the same way that they have done for often centuries. But Vienna is just a good example of that, despite there being historical elements to a city, it can be adapted.
Another thing that we wanted to kind of highlight as part of the kind of intro to inclusive design, which quite a lot of people identified when we're looking at the different photographs, is Jane Jacobs' concept of the eyes on the street, and how historically people would be quite engaged in their local neighborhood, and that kind of increased perception of safety, in that I think her theory goes as far as that you kind of knew everyone locally, and so you were all kind of looking out for each other. But if you were to translate that into modern life, it's making spaces that are occupied constantly or regularly, that allow people to feel like they're not just walking through a dark street by themselves, or they're not using a space that is neglected, and instead there's kind of different ways that you can manipulate design or encourage certain uses, which we'll kind of go on to mixed use in a minute, that allow people to feel like they're kind of part of a wider picture, and that there's someone overlooking that. And to kind of push it slightly further, it's so that people feel almost reflected within their society and within their built environment, which we touch on a little bit further down. But I think quite a lot of what our research is about is making people, and our other projects as well, is making people feel represented within their built environment and seen within their built environment, and things that they're identifying as making them feel unsafe, or places that they don't feel welcome, representing them within that space so that they feel like they can engage with it more.
So the World Bank brought out a handbook a couple of years ago about what makes a gender inclusive space, and it talked a lot about mixed use development, and it actually defined a mixed use development as a neighborhood where there's short distances to the key economic opportunities or social infrastructure and services, or where people are employed, or where care work is or hospitals are, and then there's accessible and reliable public transport to get to these areas. It's really linked with the concept of the 20-minute neighborhood or the 15-minute city. So it's an area where you can essentially live, work and play, and it's been found that a mixed use development or a mixed use space is a prime example of a gender inclusive project. They work in favour for women or for groups that are often forgotten about in the planning process. And it's what Vienna has implemented across the city. And then in the last 5 years, a lot of projects across the UK will try and include mixed use developments where you can walk to work or get public transport. The schools are in the same place as the public services. And it's just considered the perfect way to create an inclusive city that enhances safety.
Another kind of, the other key component of our workshop and kind of what we were looking to achieve is considering different users, and in particular users out with those within the design team. Obviously everyone kind of understands that people navigate and use spaces differently, not necessarily based on kind of gender, but on a variety of different things. And everyone experiences places different and has experiences and trauma that leads to them experiencing places differently. So something that we were quite passionate about encouraging practices and kind of local authorities as well to do would be to take a series of kind of almost generic photographs of people, either around the site or just kind of generally within the city or wider area, and consider how these people specifically could use space. And this idea of kind of using personas is quite commonly used by people like Architecture and Design Scotland, who encourage you to kind of take a series of different people within a group and consider what their exact needs are. And that's kind of what we're trying to implement, but with a more inclusivity based aim and an understanding of kind of previous experience that would allow for people to use space differently and need different things from public space. So we've got a few I think we're just going to run through again. We'll kind of do a brief explanation, but if anyone has anything that they would like to add or any comments on it, then please put them in the chat, because it'd be good to hear what your perspectives on them are. So the first one is Alyssa. These are not, these are just generic names before anyone tries to Google anyone. So she is a student in Edinburgh, takes a Spanish class every evening on the other side of town, and would like to apply for a graduate job in Barcelona. She commonly travels by bus, but following a sexual assault incident is permanently put off traveling by bus and cannot afford an alternative mode of transport. Consequently, she's put at disadvantage when applying for jobs and is unable to attend her Spanish evening class. I don't know if anyone has any kind of thoughts on this, but I think it highlights how one specific incident, and it doesn't necessarily need to be something as severe as like a sexual assault incident, but something can make you completely avoid an area or a method of transport. And I think there needs to be a lot more variety in terms of things being affordable, and an understanding that people will use spaces differently based on their experiences and might have different requirements. I don't know if will I move on to the next one?
Yeah. So Raymond is now living in a assisted living accommodation after undergoing a hip replacement, but otherwise is mentally and physically well, and has been traveling around London by himself up until now. And so the idea of this is to get you thinking about how many dropped curbs there are, or how many narrow pavements there are for people in a wheelchair to get past, especially at busy times or in rush hour. And in London, for example, on the London Underground, of the 270 stations, only 60 of them are actually step-free. So for somebody who needs accessible stations, the London Underground isn't entirely reliable. To travel around London by a taxi, especially at busy times, takes forever and is expensive. So when we're saying to think about how to make spaces inclusive, it's not necessarily for young women or for mothers or young girls. It's for the general population. I think a lot of our cities are designed with or for people that are able and can travel around well on public transport and aren't intimidated when it's at a busy time. But yeah. Next one.
Okay, next one is Ezra and Alexia. Ezra is a trans man and Alexia is a non-binary person. They both live in Manchester, and following a kind of recent growing trend in gay areas within Manchester now being an attraction to heterosexual groups, they no longer consider spaces that they previously felt were safe as safe and welcoming to them. And I think this is perhaps a topic for another day in terms of women now kind of turning towards a lot of queer spaces because heterosexual spaces aren't safe for them. But something that we kind of wanted to highlight with this is that even if a space is welcoming and has all the best intentions, sometimes things that are kind of out with the control of the people that run the space or have designed the space can impact how people are using it and can quite drastically change demographics and almost where those spaces need to be or what they need to be, which relates kind of a lot to what we talked about earlier. And queer theory and the book Queer Spaces talks quite a lot about how different queer people need very different requirements and how they kind of create safe spaces within them that are non-conforming and aren't necessarily attractive to people out with the queer community.
So the next one is somebody whose first language isn't English, and has recently emigrated to the UK, but wants to get involved in local planning. But the meetings or committee meetings are held at 6 p.m. on Wednesdays, and she's got young children, so can't always attend them. She doesn't understand how the planning process works, and things aren't always online, which has definitely changed since COVID. Things are definitely more, or meetings or committee groups or community engagement is more accessible to people outside of having to meet in person. But it's complicated, and I speak for myself. I graduated with a planning degree and now work for a local authority, and there's still things that I don't understand. So for somebody whose first language isn't English, I can imagine it's really difficult, and it's changing all the time. And people want to get involved, but they can't, which leads to the same people always getting involved in every application and kind of having the majority of the say of what should and shouldn't happen in their area. So the planning system isn't accessible to everyone, which is definitely a problem with local authorities or the way in which planning's governed or how people can get involved. But it just gives an example of how excluding the planning process is.
And our final persona just to run through is Dan, who's 29. He works night shifts and lives on the other side of town, has to commute through, and was originally brought up in the city, hypothetical city is Dundee, and moved to a new area after graduation. The route that he has to take through the city centre is not very tolerant of people of colour, and so he has recently been victim to hate crime along his daily route. As a result, he has had to change the way that he moves around a city, perhaps incur longer routes, and doesn't necessarily feel safe within his local community as a result of those incidents that weren't necessarily local but within the kind of wider area. And I think this similarly relates to one of the kind of earlier personas about how certain incidents or kind of recurring feelings within a city can impact how you're moving around a city. So it isn't always necessarily as easy as going from A to B or taking that one bus route that gets there. It can be quite a lot more complicated than that, and it almost needs to be mapped out in a bit of a different way and understood in a bit more of a complex way. That is kind of the end of the personas, and we realize that they're not extensive. This is a little bit of a crash course, but we hope it's kind of given a little bit of an insight into how these things can be applied within practice and can be considered by authorities and designers or policymakers to kind of consider people out with their immediate group and their personal experience, because I think experience is quite an important thing when it comes to inclusivity, and we kind of need to become more understanding as designers that are understanding and experience of how spaces work isn't necessarily correct or doesn't translate once it's put into practice. So a little bit of a brief run through of our work.
Yeah, like Kirsty said, this is a crash course or an introduction into what we do. There's so much we haven't covered and that we do at HerCollective that we've not included. We've got our website, which I think might already be in the chat, but otherwise we've got at the end, where we post bi-weekly blogs on there. And we are involved in a lot of guest lectures. We've worked with Dundee University, and we're currently working with a rape crisis centre in Scotland. I think it was mentioned at the start that Academy of Urbanism are going to be there, but we're also involved in the Healthy City Design Congress. So if anybody's going to that, then pop by and see us there. But really, we're just trying to inspire and get people involved and talking about how important it is to consider women when we're planning. And that's not just for planners, but if we're all having these conversations, whether you're involved in the design process or not, then it's going to start being talked about more, and the government or local authorities are going to realise how important it is. Yeah. But there's a few examples of what we've done so far as well.
Yeah, I think like a lot of our work, and this project kind of touches on it, but we're kind of trying to translate feminism and inclusivity and accessibility in ways that are almost accessible to designers and policymakers to make change themselves and understand the kind of relationship between people and place and policy, which obviously everyone is striving to do. Like, that's no criticism to all of us, ourselves included, but kind of how those relationships work and expand on them a little bit more to try and make the built environment more diverse and design be more diverse. So a few quick examples of our work recently. We did a collaboration with Make Space for Girls last year to look at a small kind of flexible space that women, or particularly teenage girls, could occupy within a public park, and how that could become something that closes off and opens up so that people can feel safe and can use it for socializing. And then on the top right is part of our project that you might see at the Healthy City Congress, which is on our work with a rape crisis centre and trying to find key touch points that are important in ensuring that people feel safe when they're accessing women's services and how they can be represented. And then at the bottom is a little map from a project that we've been doing in Leith about the overlap between kind of local authority priorities, available sites and like derelict areas alongside people's perception of safety. And we're hoping that that's kind of going to progress on to more of a design guide on how to create tangible and successful spaces for women and femme people within historic environments. But it's kind of a little bit of a work in progress at the moment. The other ones are slightly further ahead. And then, as Millie mentioned, we've got our blog, which we try and update as much as possible. So yeah, please have a look there or sign up if you're interested. I'll let you go on this, Millie.
So yeah, what can you do as an individual? By attending workshops like this, you're learning about why it's important, or considering things you might not necessarily have thought about before, or how that might affect you or the people around you. Also, the Women's Equality Party, Gender, Make Space for Girls, Academy of Urbanism, and the RTPI, lots of organisations are talking about this now. So attending guest lectures or reading their blogs or their websites. and then sharing what you've found or what you've learnt and read so far with planners, architects, designers, and discussing why it's important again. And then if you are a planner, or if you're a part of the design process, or the decision-making process, implementing what you've learned. So considering women or people that aren't always thought about in the process itself. But like I mentioned before, this is really important because women make up more than half of the UK's population. So it's really important to consider women's, or people who aren't always considered, needs. A gender inclusive city promotes equal rights and provides support and opportunities for women in urban areas. And enhancing inclusivity is going to result in us achieving sustainability, which is really important right now with the climate crisis, and enhancing economic development, again, really important right now with the cost of living crisis, and then just overall well-being and quality of life for the female population. And there's been so many tragedies, there always has been, that have led or have resulted because of a lack of women's safety in our cities. So if we start thinking about this now and acting on this now, we're going to see less of these horrible tragedies, and that's obviously really important. But it's something that we can all get involved on and we can all be a part of. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I think it's in the chat if anyone has any questions, but go ahead if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask. I think there's a few in there now.
Thank you so much. I thought that was really thought-provoking. I've made quite a lot of notes actually, and I like how you went from the sort of the big picture, the global sort of agenda, right down to our local areas, places we work in, but also reflecting on us as practitioners, and what we can do. So hopefully there's a takeaway there for everyone in some way. And we already had some good questions come in, so thanks for posting those in the chat. So we've got a little bit of time now. Can run up till 8 o'clock, but if we run out of questions or steam, or you're really hungry, we can wrap up early. But I also want to give people the opportunity to put themselves on camera, perhaps introduce themselves and ask their questions. So if I run through the questions in order that they came through, and if you want to come on and ask your question, great. If not, I'll just read it out. So the first question is from Hannah. So Hannah, I don't know if you want to say hi, or if you're happy for me to just read it out. Okay, I'll read it out. I can't see you. So really good question actually. Is neurodiversity another persona that you have considered? So for example, autism.
Yeah, so
sorry. Oh, you're not Hannah.
No, I'm not Hannah. I'm Nick.
Hi,
I don't know what my name is up on the thing. Oh yeah, it's Hannah. That's my daughter's name. Yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I should sort of explain that question. I mean, I was on a consultation a few months ago, and somebody who was neurally diverse pointed out that the new traffic lights that allowed cyclists to go first was confusing to her, and she really didn't like it. And it really struck me that this was something that hadn't been considered from her perspective and her persona, and made me think, yeah, that this is something that needs to be considered when designing spaces. So yeah, that was my question.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, so I think you're completely right, and that almost is the kind of beauty of the personas, is that as you have more experience probably within built environment, then you can collect different things that you've experienced over the years and kind of go, oh, that person felt like they weren't perhaps included within that decision. I'm going to think about that for a future project. And it is a kind of continual learning process. Yes, we are very passionate about spaces for people with neurodiversity, as well as kind of any learning difficulty, disability, everything. And I think quite an important part of that is genuine and effective community engagement. And as you're saying, kind of engaging with people slightly earlier and asking them specifically how those things are going to impact them, to help build more of an understanding. And I'm sure, like, for you, perhaps in a future project, you wouldn't push for lights like that. You would think about it a little bit more. So it's almost kind of being proactive with that kind of process slightly earlier, which is what we're pushing for, or using things like the personas as you're kind of developing things to understand. But yes, very interested and passionate about neurodiversity in design as well.
Maybe a topic for another session. Maybe we can follow up on that. Thanks very much, Nick. We've got a question from Andrew. Same opportunity, Andrew, if you want to pop on and ask your question, or I can just read it out.
Hi. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. First of all, thank you very much. Really interesting. So it's been great listening through your slides, and lots of interesting thoughts there. A couple for me that really stood out were about public transport and how we deal with that and try and make movement safe and inclusive, and whether there is something in kind of future transport. Transport's changing quite rapidly that could provide really good improvements. And then parks, really interesting. They're often such poor spaces. They're left till last. There's no money put into them. There's a lack of thought about stewardship. And I think a lot of our parks are designed that they work mainly for boys, particularly older boys, and then you get Muggers, which are more or less all boys. And if we're going to meet the Equality Act, we probably should be spending some more money on making more diverse spaces. And I haven't read a lot of research on it, but so wondered if there's anything more on those kind of issues. And in relation to diversity too, we've just been designing some park spaces with landscape architects, looking at, can we create little mini areas where people that don't like a lot of noise and activity can be taken away by parents. So they've got a quiet space, but then you find those spaces can at night sometimes be quite considered as pretty unsafe and dangerous. So looking at how they're used at different times of the day by different types of people and how you can multi-purpose some of them potentially. But yeah, really interested in your thoughts on parks and making those better places.
Yeah, we are, sorry, I'm quite bad for that, just constantly talking. We're currently working on a project with a firm to kind of help them decide how, particularly for planning, how they're impacting equality and inclusivity within their design, and kind of doing similar exercises to this, but on a kind of more specific scale. But in terms of other kind of resources, I would definitely recommend having a look at the work of Make Space for Girls, who we did our collab with. But they, a lot of their work, they're basically campaigning for parks that are better equipped for teenage girls, and they've conducted some community engagement specifically on that topic. And there's a lot on there about kind of how the Equality Act 2010 requires, and the Equality Duty as well, I think the Equality Duty 2007 requires people to, and local authorities to have spaces that are gender equal and provide equity, and that's not necessarily the case at the moment. So they're probably someone I would recommend. There is also a lot of interesting research into how girls and boys could have segregated parks and how they can kind of relate to each other, particularly over, I think, in Denmark. And as another aside, we're doing a project, I think, in a couple of weeks with Girl Guiding Scotland, on how they would redesign parks for themselves and their peers, and what priorities they have, and because they seem very engaged with the safety of women and young girls in public space. So there will be updates on that on our page at some point that I would recommend having a look at.
Perfect, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And we had a really good comment from Rashini. I don't know if Rashini, if you want to come on and just add that yourself, but I think there's an interesting point around sort of the equality impact assessments that local authorities and governments in fact need to do. And actually you've given some inspiration as to how you might do that through the profiling, through different consultation exercises. So Rashini, feel free to pitch in if there's anything else you wanted to add. If not, yeah.
First of all, that was a really nice presentation, and I would like to get involved in the future and volunteer. If you have any events, I can mail you separately. And yes, as I mentioned, it would be useful to, if the local authorities take into consideration amending policies in the future, local development plans, and it is interesting to see how that might come forward, especially with equality impact assessments being undertaken in determining planning applications, which is not as serious right now. But yeah, hopefully it will become a statutory policy, and also probably some supplementary guidances might come on that too. So yeah. Interesting.
From a local authority background, I know that equality impact assessments are only used when it's a major development, which of course there's so many applications that come in, there's not often time for a whole equality impact assessment. But I think we forget that even minor extensions or signage or just anything that all people use or people walk past affect the whole general population. So there's a problem there, but I think that's just because planning that's understaffed, there's not enough time, people don't have the training on how to think about different, like the personas activity. And then again, like Kirsty mentioned before, with community engagement, it's always the same people who are getting involved. In England, there's parish councils, and they'll have the same people sitting on the parish council board for decades. And community groups are often at times that not everyone can attend. So it's difficult. I think it's important that we think about ways in which people can get involved, which aren't necessarily always through local authorities. So if kind of statutory consultees or people that comment on applications have more of an understanding, or people know how to join them and get involved, then we can think about how different people use space. But I think, yeah, you're right, equality impact assessments are really important. There's not enough time for them to be taken into consideration in every application.
It also feels like, to a certain extent, from my experience in practice, that by the time it gets to planning, it's almost too late. Obviously, planning departments are very much trying to ensure equality, but if the architect hasn't considered it and the client hasn't considered it, then by the time you get to planning, you'd have to completely reconfigure everything to try and meet those standards. So it's very important that authorities are relaying the information and ensuring that it's happening at that stage. But I also think it needs to be implemented in practice and thought of from concept design, really, or from brief. There needs to be an understanding of how it's inclusive, what the kind of standards are that the organisation are wanting to hit. Are they wanting to hit the Equality Act? Are they wanting to ensure that it's completely barrier-free, accessible, etc.? That needs to be happening from the get-go, really. But that is a hard thing to sell. So yeah, that we're kind of hoping to inspire people to keep researching and hopefully find ways of selling the vision of that to clients and to colleagues as well.
I think as well, it's sort of connecting to what the Academy does, is bringing different professions together. And that was something that I noticed in some of the questions tonight as well, like sort of landscape architects working with architects, planners, economic development people, sort of trying to get those conversations. So we are really joining those dots. I think that came across quite strongly. And if anyone does want to add a few more questions, we've got a bit of time, but if not, I'll wrap it up in the next few minutes. A question from me really is about what HerCollective has in store next. I mean, you've already done such interesting, inspiring work, but can you reveal what's in store?
So we've got in a couple of weeks a workshop that we're running in Scotland for girl guiding. I'm not sure how much we can say so far, but there'll be posts soon on our website, on the blog. Like I mentioned before, for the Healthy City Design Congress, if anybody's going to that, we'll be there. And again, we'll be summarising anything or everything on the blog. I think if you want to talk about
one of our main projects at the moment is the one I kind of mentioned briefly on designing for women's crisis services, and we're hoping to push that project and finalize kind of concept design soon for that, which I think will make a really big difference to how crisis services are kind of perceived locally, and then hopefully implemented further afield and documented. Our Leith project will kind of continue in the background and hopefully lead to some sort of exhibition and guidance on how to design inclusively within historic environments. And then otherwise, we're kind of just doing more stuff like this, really. Expanding on it further and taking it into practice and reviewing proposals based on kind of our experience and research knowledge in this area as well.
Yeah,
so
that's very important, and I think you've given us a sort of clear framework, examples, and also just the comment you made earlier about how in Vienna conservation policy was flexible enough to kind of adapt and sort of think about equality and respond in that way. I think there's other areas that our built environment might need to consider in that way, and policy levers that we can use to try and create more inclusive environments. So yeah, lots of food for thought there. So I don't see any more questions, so I hope you don't mind if you're okay to wrap up there for tonight, because I'm sure the conversations will carry on at another point. But yeah, I just want to thank you both so much for your time tonight, and everyone who's attended and asking such brilliant questions. If you liked what you heard and you want to stay involved in the Academy, please do check your newsletters, sign up, tell your friends, colleagues, and this session was recorded, so we will share this as well when it's ready. So have a great evening, everyone, and thanks again. Take care.